Hi guys, today I'm going to bring you a bit of a video log of the construction of my furnace. I'm actually going to start off by switching over to a photo of the furnace in its current state so you can see how it looks, the design that I've gone for and how it's turned out. I've still got another step to go, which is to actually weld it all together, but apart from that it's pretty much all done and ready to go. So I won't keep people waiting around until the end of the video in case you just want to see that. Then I'm going to go through a quick kind of wrap up of the process that I've gone through from start to probably about midway through, and then do a second video doing the last few processes. So to keep it short, I'm not going to do one big long video with all of the building stages. I've put a lot of time into this. I think probably 70 or more hours build time has gone into this, because pretty much everything that I've done has been by hand. The only power tools I've used have been a drill and just recently a Dremel, and obviously the welding equipment I'll be using, but the rest of it is completely done by hand. No kind of power tools, nothing. And a lot of the stuff that I've done was my first time doing it, so not perfect in places, definitely took longer than it needed to, but I'm really happy with how it's turned out so far. So I'm going to switch over now to an image of the furnace as it is right now. Okay, and here it is. So anybody that's familiar with Paul's garage and his furnace design, it's pretty much a copy and paste of his for the main part, but I have got a few tweaks and modifications in there that you're probably noticing. The first thing is mine's actually got handles. I don't remember if Paul ever added any to his, because I know he was using the mole grips. I don't have any mole grips that I trust well enough to use as handles, so those are there. Now those are actually the ones for the main body of the furnace. I'm going to be making some slightly smaller ones for the lid itself, but I need handles on both the body and the lid because it's all bloody heavy. More so than I really expected. So yeah, there's the first one. The second is, you'll notice some weird protrusion coming from the right hand side of the build with a wire coming out into a readout. That's actually a K-type thermocouple. The reason for that is, although you can just blast the heat into the furnace and know you're probably going to melt it, I'd rather have a readout. One, so I can manage my fuel use. I'm a little bit of a cheapskate, so I don't want to use excessive fuel if I don't have to. And two is to kind of gauge what temperature the furnace can actually reach. I wasn't planning on doing anything above copper, but if I can get higher temperatures around the 15 to 1600 degrees, I might try iron, but that's a long time down the future. The other reason is, again, it's just, it will help teach me to recognise the rough temperature of the furnace based on the interior colour. For anyone that has used a furnace like this before, they'll know that the glowing colour inside of the crucible and of the metal themselves will give you an indication roughly of how hot it is. And that transitions from a dark red to an orange to a yellow and then to a glowing white, again depending on the temperature of the metal involved. So it's not really super important, but it's something that I'd like to learn, that, you know, if ever I don't have access to the thermocouple or the thermometer for whatever reason, maybe I burn it out or I just don't have it at hand, I've misplaced it, I can start to figure out temperature by sight, which would be useful. You'll also notice that I seem to have some framework and the edges around my furnace are a bit sharper than Paul's. That's because what he did was he basically shaped the metal around using a metal brake. I don't have one of those, so I couldn't just wrap my furnace around in steel, which is actually probably the more efficient way of doing it compared to what I did. What I actually had to do was measure out each panel individually, from the width at the top to the width to the bottom, and then the overall height, and then hand cut them using forged metal shears that I found in the workshop, which, again, time consuming, hard work. My hands were not happy with me at the end of it, but I'm actually quite happy with the look it's turned out with. But now I have to weld each individual panel to the frame and to the adjacent panel, which again will be a massive time sink. It probably is going to take a couple of days of welding, especially since I'm not a particularly proficient welder. I've only welded a couple of times before, and all the training I got was basically how not to hurt yourself when you're welding. As far as actual technique, I've got no clue. I am a complete novice. Again, I know how to not hurt myself when using the welder, but that's as far as my knowledge goes, really. And the other downside is the only welder I have access to is a TIG, and a pretty high powered one at that. So I'm going to have a really hard time controlling the temperatures I'm going to be using to try and weld this together, especially when you've got the difference in thickness between the angle and the sheet itself. But I'm going to have to give it a go. But yeah, that's the gist of it for the time being. Excuse me. As I say, all I have left to do is the welding now, and it's all finished, and I can finally start to use it properly. And you know, you guys will hopefully be seeing me doing my castings very soon. But there it is as it stands. And for anyone that's now going to leave, now you've seen the furnace, that's fine. You know, thanks for coming and watching the video as it is. But for anybody that actually wants to stick around and see some of the building process, you know, thanks for sticking around and having a look. I'm glad that you're interested. If you want a more condensed version, a version that you probably should follow, I'd recommend watching Paul's, because there are things that I do that probably aren't as good as what he did, but I wanted to try some slight variation. If you're just interested to see the differences, again, you know, please continue to watch. But with that, let's switch back to the other screen. Okay, so now you've seen my furnace as it stands, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to be switching over to footage that I took at various stages of the build. Now the camera quality is not great, because back then I was using a cheap video recorder that you get off of Amazon, because my phone had died, so I didn't have that to shoot video. I didn't have access to the webcam that I'm actually using to record a lot of my footage here at home. So the video is not going to look great. I'm also going to be having to do voiceovers again, because the audio is terrible and I don't have a decent lapel microphone, or just a microphone in general. So I'll be showing the footage. You won't be able to see me really, because where I was working, again, it was at work, and I couldn't really show off the whole area because I don't really have permission to, you know, shoot footage of my workspace. So it'll be quite close up. You'll just be seeing my work area itself, and I'll be doing a little bit of the voiceover work, describing what's happening in each stage. So let's move on to the first bit of footage. Okay, and so here we have my rather small, rather messy work area. You can see the VicCast box in front, which is a supplier for the fire brick, and each box contains 3 of these lovely white fire insulating bricks, and they're actually made from alumina, which is the other name for aluminium or aluminum oxide. For anybody that doesn't know this, most ceramics are actually formed from a metal oxide. So anybody that's melting down aluminium or aluminum and you're getting that dross on top, that's actually, a lot of it is oxide, so it's the stuff that makes up these bricks. So if anyone melts down enough aluminium and can harvest enough of that dross, maybe they can find a way of making their own bricks, who knows. So all I'm doing is inspecting each brick, making sure there's no major damage, and if there is, deciding how I'm going to cut it to minimise the loss of each brick. And on to the next scene. Okay, and here you can see the bricks next to the sink. What I'm about to do is actually soak all of the bricks before I cut them. And I got this from Jeff, the veg roll guy, if any of you seen his video on his electric furnace that he made. And the purpose for this is purely when I cut into the brick, I don't want a lot of dust and particles flying around as I'm cutting it. And with this being quite a soft brick, it breaks down into that powder very easily when you're cutting it, which we don't want. If you were to cut them dry, you need some kind of dust mask or respirator. So you can see a lot of bubbling happening as I'm putting the bricks in. These bricks are very porous and full of air. The reason being is air is a very good insulator of heat. But we want to make sure these bricks are completely soaked all the way through. So we have to wait for the bubbling to stop. When that happens, you've pretty much forced all the air out and you know that moisture's got to the very centre of the brick. So I'll just leave them soaking, and then I'll get a couple of the bricks out. One I'll start cutting right away, which will make a bit of a mess because of the water still in them. The second one will be drying as I'm cutting the first, and then as I start to cut the second one, I'll pull the third one out to drain, and so on. Okay, let's move on to the cutting. Okay, so we're back over at the workbench and my little work area, and I'm just going to go over very briefly the tools and equipment I was using. What I've just picked up there is literally just a sacrificial board that I'm placing on top of the actual work surface, and all it's for is so I can cut down the brick all the way through without having to worry about marring the actual work surface and irritating all of my colleagues who will have to use it after me. Next up is this lovely handsaw that I picked up brand new specifically for this project, and I kind of wish I hadn't bothered, because these bricks are actually very abrasive when you're cutting into them. Basically the powder, it breaks down too. Even though it's soaked, it still wears away at the surface of the tool as you're using it, and it actually polishes and sands away the metal. I'll show you in a second the protective sleeve that the saw comes in, which is coming up just now, and you'll notice this lovely Predator logo across the front. That was actually etched onto the saw itself, and through me cutting through this brick, it's actually completely sanded away and polished off that logo. It no longer exists on the saw. So if you've got an older saw lying around that you don't mind dyeing, I'd recommend using that before you buy a brand new one for this kind of work, because it won't last. Here you can see some of the teeth that haven't been used versus the ones that have, and how much it's actually cut away from the teeth. Again, because it's a soft ceramic, even with not much left on the blade, it will still go through it, not a problem. But just so you're aware, these bricks will damage your tools, so don't use anything that's dear to your heart, because it won't make it through the build. Okay, and then the next thing I have are these soft brushes that, again, Paul recommended to use in his video. I'd never used a foam brush before, but I thought I'd give it a go. This is just for applying the mortar to the bricks, and you'll see later how I get on with that, but yeah, I'm not great at it. And then I've also got a scraper, which I kind of use like an easel, just to gather large amounts of the cement, and later on when I got more comfortable and I was less delicate and precious when it come to putting the mortar on, I ended up applying it using this scraper, which was more efficient in the end. Okay, so I've just fast forwarded slightly because I was talking too much about the scraper in the original footage. And this is the mason jar I was using to water down the mortar. So originally my first coat of mortar was this watered down version that was soaked up into the brick. I thought it would give it a better bind to the mortar itself, and that's literally all that jar was for. Okay, so here we are finally at the brick itself. So what I have to do first is actually mark the edges where I'm going to be cutting it from. So I've already marked the top edge. This is just 14mm in from either side, and that's how wide I'm going to be cutting into the front face of the brick. And I have to actually measure the bottom out, same distance, and then connect the two lines, which is what I'm going to do now. You've probably noticed the lovely pool of water that's sat on top of that sacrificial piece of wood. even though I've left that to dry slightly, it still is going to seep out some water. So if you do this and you do soak the bricks, bear in mind you are going to have a little bit of excess water coming out. So yeah, as I mentioned, just marking out the 14mm in from each edge. There are going to be parts where not a lot is going to be happening, so I might speed up the video here and there, depending on how long I'm taking actually marking and cutting, just so you're not completely bored out of your mind watching. Okay, now I've got the edges on the front face marked out. I'm just drawing that line connecting each mark so I can see where I need to cut when I put my saw to the brick. There we are. Now you can see the straight parallel lines going down the front face, and this is what I'm going to be following as I'm cutting down, cutting these little triangular sections out of the brickwork, and that's kind of the view I'll have from the front. Here I'm basically measuring the brick at the halfway point, so that will give me the complete triangle that I want to actually cut out of the brickwork, so that I can form my equilateral shape all the way around. There it is. That is all I'm taking off of each corner of each brick. It's a very small amount, and it does mean that the segment I'm cutting is prone to actually snapping off, which is a little bit of a nuisance, but you'll see shortly how I come to deal with that. Okay, here we are almost 18 minutes into the video, and it's finally time to make a cut. So I actually start off very carefully and very gently, trying to score into the top of the brick and just start the cut very steadily. I'm just going to work my blade in, and again I do take it very carefully because of how brittle this brick is. If I just go in full speed, there's a good chance I'll just tear it open and crack the small part that I'm cutting away off. It'll just chip away into small pieces, which is not what I wanted. You'll see in a few minutes why I wanted to maintain this corner piece as best as possible. Unfortunately, as I'm cutting down, it will snap off at a certain point just because of the sideways pressure that's being forced on the small corner part as I'm cutting it down. It gets less and less material to support it as I cut down, and it gets steadily heavier as that piece becomes longer that's being cut away. I'll just leave this running at regular time just so you can see how careful I started off, and as I gradually sped up as I got more comfortable. You'll also occasionally see me snagging. I'm not sure whether this was dry spots in the brick or where my teeth were more worn away, or if it was just hard spots, but it does occasionally snag, and I have to try and work that out without, again, putting too much force through it so that it snaps off. You can also see, because it's soaked, there's no dust flying off. It's actually, fairly clean, apart from that pile of mulch you're seeing at the bottom. And You may have seen it in the sped up part of the video that I've had to actually wipe down the brick and the table just because of how much moisture is still flooding out of it. Again, because it's so porous and so aerated, it holds a lot of moisture and it does trickle out very slowly. So yeah, you can see I'm being a little bit more confident as I'm sawing through that brick now. I think around about between a third and a halfway through is where I actually chip off this particular segment. But again, it's bound to happen with this type of brickwork. You just got to accept it and deal with it as best as you can. If you try this yourselves, don't get discouraged when it does snap off. And if you can cut all the way down without breaking a piece off, then fair play to you, because I don't think I was able to do that once. In all of the bricks that I cut down, apart from when it was on its other side, you'll see that in the later part of the video, I couldn't actually get a completely clean cut all the way through. And there it is, it's just snapped off. Now there wasn't a lot of extra sideways force, it was just the weight of that particular piece got to the point where it couldn't support itself anymore, it just snapped clean off. But now I have to try and work the saw back in and maintain that cut down the guidelines without eating way too much into the brick itself. So I did previously try and cut from the other end down, but it ended up mating poorly when I got there, so I ended up just trying to get my saw back in line and work my way down it again, as you'll see in a second. Some of those earlier cuts that I did not turn out very well, and I'll see if we've got any footage of some of the earlier pieces I did. So what I'm doing there is working my way back into the brickwork, trying my best not to angle the blade in, trying to keep it flush against that edge, and then just work my way back down into the cut. I'm even just kind of touching away at the brickwork above it just to try and get my saw in behind the part where it chipped off. And you can see by the way I'm gripping the saw, I'm not putting any real pressure into it, I'm letting the saw do all of the work. It's just that backwards and forwards motion and just letting it break the brick down, as opposed to trying to cut into it deep. It does just break away as you're pushing the saw backwards and forwards. And what's going to happen is the footage is going to cut out before I make all the way through. That's just because my SD card filled up while I was doing the cuts themselves. So the footage will switch again before the end of the cut, and you'll see me doing the other side. I'll probably speed that entire cut up just so you can see it finished, but there's actually a point at the end I need to make as to the first difference between my furnace build and the build that Paul did and the first change that I made. Here's a switch to the other side. Again, I've sped this up just because you've seen me cut one side down. You don't really need to see me doing it again at regular speed. I'm just going to be cutting down this side, same as I did the other, and saving the corner. Now the reason being, if you've seen Paul's build, you'll know that when he cuts the front, and that's where he does the joining of the bricks, at the back there's a large cavity, and I didn't actually like that. I wanted it to be a solid body. So the reason I'm being so careful cutting these corner pieces is I want to save them, and then I basically want to turn them onto the back uncut edge and mortar them on, so that it forms a more continuous edge to mortar to do the brick. so that they're more a single solid object rather than having these big gaps at the back, which once you see the steel sheet wrapped around, you can see just this big cavity in the corners at the back, and I didn't like that. So I thought I could try and modify the design slightly and waste less of the brick. So here you've seen me actually get through it, and the speed should go back to normal now. And I'm just trying to show that I've done my best to maintain the same distance being cut off all the way down. It's not perfect, but considering we're doing it freehand, it's not bad. So here I'm going to illustrate that I want to take this corner piece that I've just removed, and that's how I want to rotate it onto the back end, and that should create a continuous plane all the way along that edge. And if I'd cut the brick accurately, that should more or less be perfectly flush, and that would be the same for all of the bricks. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, my cutting is not brilliant, so there ended up being a lot of variation, so it wasn't perfect, and this actually ended up making my life a lot harder in the future part of the build, which again you'll see that later. So I like the idea still, but if I was ever going to rebuild this again, hopefully not anytime soon, I'd end up making a jig to put the brick in as I cut it, so that the cuts are all consistent. So even if parts of the brickwork start to break away, I can just get back onto it with no problems, and it should be a nice consistent angle all the way down the length of the brick on both sides, and that would actually help when you come to make the bricks later. But because they were all a bit janky, it didn't quite work out the way I wanted, and as I said, it made my life a lot harder. So now I'm just preparing the bricks to be mortared, and I'm going to fast forward a little bit until it gets to an actual application of the mortar itself. If you could keep up with it, was just showing you the original consistency of the mortar and how I watered it down using the cocktail mixer method to actually water it down. So here I'm just pointing out where I'm going to be applying that fine mortar to the brick, just so they can seep in and start that first bond with the mortar and the brickwork. And I'm actually going to be attaching this small cutout to the main body of the brick. Okay, and here we are for the final piece of footage for this particular video. You'll notice in the background the vidcast box has gone. I was actually using that to cover up some bricks I'd done previously, and you can kind of see how they've been mortared together. You can also notice that there's a lot of chips and breakaway parts that I've tried to stick back on just to try and maintain that rear corner. They don't always turn out perfect, but I was doing the best that I could. Okay, so where the last piece of footage left off it was just applying this fine watered down mortar to the main body of the brickwork, which I'm doing again now here. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to keep applying it. I'm going to keep allowing the brick to absorb it in as much as it can, and when it starts to become saturated, I know that I've got enough in there. It stops absorbing down, it stays somewhat soggy on the top. And then I'll do the same on the smaller corner pieces, and then I'll apply the main non-watered down mortar to actually create that bond. I'll keep it running regular speed at first, just so you can see how I'm applying this mortar. It's not particularly interesting, but again, it's just to show the process. I'm sure you know by now what's happening, but just in case you want to see it, this is pretty much how it went. And you can see now why the build's taken so many hours, because manually sawing down each brick by hand, trying to maintain this corner piece without breaking it off, and then piece by piece reassembling this big 3D jigsaw with mortar. Very time consuming, very tedious, but I really wanted this furnace to turn out well, so I took the time to try and get it as close to the way I designed it as possible. Looking back again, I'd have probably changed a few things if I do this again in the future, but I'm hoping that just because of how much time it took me, I won't have to be doing that again anytime soon. So as I say, I'll just let the video roll on for now. Once I've started applying the main mortar to actually create the bond, I might start to speed it up again, just so you can see how this side looks fully assembled. Scraper in my left hand. I'm just about to start the main application of the thick mortar to try and get a bond between the main brick and the smaller pieces that were cut off. You're going to see that I'm very gentle and cautious when I'm doing this. When I first started doing this, I was very inexperienced. I've never done any kind of brickwork of any kind before, so I've never really worked with the mortar either. So I was being very careful not to damage the brick, especially with how soft and how easy it is to damage it. I was being as careful as I possibly could when I was applying it. In later stages I get a lot more comfortable. I realise what the brick can and can't take, and I end up just going for it with the scraper because I know that one, it pushes it down better than uh, the foam brush, which you can see right now. It's not really sticking it down, it's just kind of pulling it off in a lot of places, which isn't brilliant. It's just much quicker and much more efficient to use the scraper, and you get a better finish. You can do it with a brush like I'm showing you here. It's just, again, it's slow. It doesn't give the best finish, but again, it's not bad. If you want to take the time with it and you want to be careful not to damage the bricks, there's nothing wrong with doing it this way. Or if you just don't have the scraper at hand, you know, this is a way to do it. So that's pretty much me got that main brick nice and mortared now. It's fairly clean, and I should be moving on to the small piece. Yep, and I'm going to put a little bit of mortar on that, which to be honest is probably overkill. I've got enough on the brick to just push that smaller piece on, but again, this was early days for me. This was my first few bricks that I'd mortared together, and I was still kind of getting the procedure down, figuring out what worked and what didn't. So that's that mortar applied, and I just try and squeeze that down. Now I had to be very careful where the tip of this corner was finished. It would tend to break away if I pushed too hard, so I had to try and get enough pressure down there that it would stick, but not so much the brick would just break away in my hands. It was very tricky. And then I had the problem of the squish out the back with the amount of mortar I was using. I later found out that having this was actually beneficial because it gave a better bond, having it actually coming out the sides. As long as I neatened it up and made a continuous straight edge rather than having it all lumpy and horrible, which is what I'm trying to do there. I'm trying to maintain that constant angle down the side of the brick face. Again, because the cuts weren't perfect, the angle was not continuous and constant, which is a shame, but there it is. That's just how it turned out. And I'll do this for the other two broken pieces you see at the front, and then I'll do the exact same on the other side of the brick. You can see to the left of me a few more broken pieces. They're actually for the other side of the brick. So yeah, all 9 of the main kind of borderline bricks, the main kind of body of the furnace, I did this for. I cut the corners down by hand, I mortared them, and I put these corner pieces back in on all 9 bricks, and then I ended up having to shape them and position them for the base, which will be in the next video. After this is all kind of assembled, that's where I'm going to end it. So yeah, I'm going to speed this up a little bit now you've started to see the procedure, and I'll come back to you again once it's all assembled. And there it is, one corner of one brick cut and mortared. and you can see from the time of the video just how long it took me to get to that stage. So let's switch back to my ugly mug. Okay, and there we have it, guys. This is the end to the first half of my how I built my furnace video series, whatever. So for anyone that did actually stick around through the whole video, thank you very much. I understand that it was a very long and probably a very tedious video to watch, especially if you've watched videos by Paul, Veg Oil Guy, or Perry SW. They did more concise and to the point videos, and they're probably a lot easier to watch and digest, whereas mine probably went into too much detail. But I wanted to get across some of the choices that I made in my furnace and why I made them, and I also wanted people to understand how much time is involved if they wanted to try and build something like this. Obviously, if you build it a different way to me, if you use one of the other guys' methods, it probably will be a bit quicker than what I did. And if I was to rebuild this, I would make my life a lot easier, and I would adjust parts of the build to make it a bit more streamlined. But as you just seen from the image from the start, I'm pretty happy with how it's turned out now. But that outer shell does hide a lot of the work that went on underneath. So in the next video, I'm going to cover the shaping of the exterior core, shall we say, the main body of the furnace itself, and the actual cutting and mortaring of the base, and then probably moving on to the framework. So if you've got any kind of questions about the video, anything you want to know about my design in particular, please leave them in the comments and I'll get back to you. And yeah, thanks very much for watching again, and hopefully I'll see you again soon. Bye bye.